Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. At the Center for Trauma and Resilience Research, we believe that healing and growth are both deeply personal and profoundly communal. Whether you are a clinician, educator, advocate, student, policymaker, or someone seeking to better understand the effects of trauma, your presence here matters. This presentation is an opportunity to explore how cutting-edge research, compassionate care, and lived experience come together to advance mental health, emotional resilience, and social change. We know that trauma touches every community, but so does the power of resilience. Our mission is rooted in a simple yet powerful idea that recovery is possible and knowledge can be a pathway to hope. Through science, storytelling, and systemic innovation, we aim to foster spaces that are safe, inclusive, and transformative. We're honored to have you with us as we share, learn, and imagine a future where resilience is nurtured. Trauma is addressed with dignity, and every person has the opportunity to thrive. Welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Resentment is a deeply rooted and often misunderstood emotion that touches nearly every human experience. At its core, resentment arises when we perceive that we've been wronged, whether by a person, a group, or a system, and feel powerless to address the injustice. Unlike momentary anger, resentment simmers, often lingering beneath the surface and shaping our thoughts, relationships, and behaviors over time. In this section, we introduce the emotion of resentment not as a flaw in character, but as a meaningful psychological and social signal. It reflects unmet needs, violated expectations, and unresolved injuries. We'll explore how resentment differs from related emotions like anger, bitterness, or envy, and why it tends to be morally charged, connected to our beliefs about fairness, recognition, and dignity. Understanding resentment helps us make sense of both personal experiences and broader social phenomena, from strained family dynamics to collective political grievances. Our goal is to frame resentment as a complex emotional process that, when acknowledged and examined, can actually become a tool for self-awareness, healing, and change. Let's begin by unpacking what resentment is, where it comes from, and why it matters, both psychologically and relationally.
To understand resentment, we must begin with a clear and nuanced definition. Resentment is not just prolonged anger or bitterness, it is a moral emotion, typically arising when a person perceives that they or their group has been unfairly treated, disrespected, or excluded. It is often tied to feelings of betrayal, injustice, or humiliation, and unlike momentary emotions, resentment tends to linger and accumulate over time. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Max Scheler distinguished resentment from ordinary anger by its deep-rooted and often suppressed nature. It becomes a lens through which individuals reinterpret past events and justify current frustrations. In psychology, resentment is recognized as a secondary emotion, emerging when primary emotions like hurt, fear, or disappointment are left unprocessed. But why is resentment important to define and understand? Its scope is vast. It shows up in personal relationships, workplace dynamics, political discourse, and even international conflicts. It underlies social movements, informs voting behaviors, and shapes public sentiment. When unacknowledged, resentment can erode trust, foster division, and contribute to cycles of blame and defensiveness. Yet, when recognized and examined, it can offer insight into unmet needs, violated values, and the desire for restoration. We'll explore how resentment works not only within individuals, but across communities and cultures. By defining its components, cognitive, emotional, and moral, we gain tools to recognize its signals and understand its impact, making way for empathy, resolution, and growth. To understand resentment as more than a fleeting emotion, we must explore its rich historical and theoretical roots. Philosophically, the emotion of resentment was first seriously analyzed by Friedrich Nietzsche, who coined the term ressentiment to describe a deep, repressed hostility that arises when individuals or groups feel powerless to respond directly to those they perceive as having wronged them. Nietzsche viewed ressentiment as central to the development of moral systems that invert values, where the oppressed deem their powerlessness as a virtue and strength as vice. Max Scheler expanded this idea, distinguishing ressentiment from moral indignation. According to Scheler, resentment is a toxic emotion that emerges when individuals repeatedly suppress feelings of envy, anger, and inferiority, ultimately constructing an inverted moral order to cope with their status or suffering. In more recent decades, sociologists and political theorists have picked up these ideas to examine how resentment fuels collective behaviors. Scholars like Martha Nussbaum and William Davies argue that resentment can become institutionalized, feeding populist movements, ideological polarization, and distrust of authority. In this sense, resentment becomes more than personal. It is social, political, and deeply historical. Contemporary psychology also recognizes resentment as an emotion linked to moral judgment and perceived injustice. It often arises when expectations are unmet and when there is a sense that one's values, status, or identity have been dismissed or violated. Thus, theoretical perspectives, from philosophy to psychology, frame resentment not just as a response to unfair treatment, but as a narrative emotion. It links past harm to current grievance and future identity. It is, in essence, an emotional thread that connects individual experiences with collective memory and cultural meaning. Psychological underpinnings of resentment. Resentment is a deeply complex emotional response rooted in the perception of injustice, betrayal, or unmet expectations. Psychologically, it is often triggered when individuals feel wronged, powerless to respond, or denied validation of their experiences. Unlike anger, which can be direct and fleeting, resentment tends to simmer over time, becoming a chronic, internalized form of emotional protest. From a cognitive standpoint, resentment involves ruminative thought patterns. Individuals replay perceived wrongs, mentally rehearse injustices, and assign blame, often amplifying emotional distress. These cognitive loops can become self-reinforcing, shaping not only mood, but also one's sense of identity and worldview. Emotionally, resentment is frequently paired with feelings of humiliation, envy, frustration, and moral outrage. It becomes particularly potent when the person believes the offense was intentional or when the harm challenges their core values or dignity. For example, being overlooked, misunderstood, or unfairly judged can provoke not only sadness, but also resentment, especially if the individual believes there is no path to restitution or recognition. Psychodynamic theories suggest that resentment may serve as a defense mechanism, masking deeper emotions like shame or grief. Rather than expressing vulnerability, the resentful person redirects those emotions outward, often toward a person or system perceived as unjust. Importantly, unresolved resentment can have psychological costs. It can contribute to anxiety, depression, chronic stress, and strained relationships. However, understanding these emotional mechanisms allows for interventions. Emotional regulation, cognitive reframing, and therapeutic dialogue are powerful tools for transforming resentment into insight, assertiveness, and even healing. Ultimately, resentment is not a flaw, it's a signal. It alerts us to boundaries crossed, values compromised, or identities wounded. When understood and processed, it can become a catalyst for personal growth and emotional integrity. Resentment in interpersonal relationships. Resentment often takes root in the context of close relationships between partners, family members, friends, or colleagues, where expectations and emotional investments run high. It frequently arises when one party feels overlooked, taken for granted, or chronically mistreated, and when grievances remain unacknowledged or unresolved. Unlike fleeting anger, resentment is a more enduring emotion. It builds over time through repeated disappointments or perceived betrayals. For instance, someone might feel resentful if they continuously give in a relationship, but feel that the other person does not reciprocate care, respect, or effort. This internalized sense of injustice can erode trust, create emotional distance, and hinder honest communication. In romantic partnerships, resentment may stem from imbalanced responsibilities, unmet emotional needs, or unresolved past wounds. In parent-child relationships, it can be fueled by perceived favoritism, control, or neglect. Among friends or coworkers, it might emerge from jealousy, broken boundaries, or lack of recognition. What makes resentment particularly difficult is that it often goes unspoken. It simmers quietly, manifesting as sarcasm, passive aggression, or emotional withdrawal. Over time, these unexpressed feelings can undermine the foundation of the relationship. However, resentment can also be a signal, a warning that something in the relational dynamic needs attention or repair. Recognizing and addressing resentment with compassion, honest dialogue, and boundary setting can pave the way toward healing and deeper connection. Ultimately, understanding resentment in our relationships requires emotional literacy, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront discomfort for the sake of mutual growth. Resentment in interpersonal relationships. Let's talk about where resentment often lives, right in the heart of our closest relationships. Whether it's with a spouse, a parent, a friend, or a colleague, resentment typically doesn't appear overnight. Instead, it grows quietly, often beneath the surface, when someone feels repeatedly unheard, unappreciated, or emotionally dismissed. This isn't the same as a moment of anger or irritation. It's a pattern of unresolved hurt that solidifies over time. Think of a partner who always takes on the lion's share of household tasks without acknowledgement, or a friend who constantly leans on us for support but is never around when we need them. These moments can seem small in isolation, but when they stack up without repair, they create emotional weight, and that's resentment. What makes resentment especially tough is how silently it operates. We may not even realize we're harboring it until it starts showing up in our tone of voice, in avoidance, in sarcasm, or even in physical withdrawal. We might find ourselves thinking, why bother saying anything? Nothing will change. and so the cycle continues. But here's the important part. Resentment isn't just a destructive force, it's also an emotional signal. It tells us that a boundary has been crossed or that a need has gone unmet for too long. If we can pause and listen to that signal with compassion, it can become a starting point for healing instead of conflict. That healing begins with courage. Courage to have honest conversations, to express vulnerability, and to hear one another without defensiveness. It may mean renegotiating roles, responsibilities, or even expectations. It may also require learning how to forgive or how to let go of dynamics that no longer serve us. In the end, resentment in relationships is not a sign of weakness or failure. It's a human response to feeling unseen or undervalued. When we learn to address it directly, we open the door to greater intimacy, trust, and emotional balance.
Resentment, when left unaddressed, can erode our mental health, distort relationships, and cloud our judgment. Fortunately, there are practical and evidence-based strategies for managing resentment that empower individuals to regain emotional clarity, re-establish trust, and foster inner peace. First and foremost is awareness. Recognizing the presence of resentment is key. Naming the emotion helps bring it into conscious awareness, which is the first step toward healing. Reflecting on what triggered the resentment and whether it stems from unmet needs, perceived injustices, or unresolved pain allows for better emotional insight. Second, emotional regulation techniques such as mindfulness, deep breathing, journaling, and physical activity can reduce the physiological arousal that accompanies resentment. These practices help ground us in the present moment and provide space to process emotions without acting on them impulsively. Empathic perspective taking is another powerful tool. Trying to understand the other person's intent, limitations, or context does not excuse harmful behavior, but it can reduce black and white thinking and soften emotional rigidity. Where possible, communication and boundary setting can be transformative. Expressing feelings assertively, rather than suppressing or exploding with anger, invites dialogue and validation. Clarifying expectations and needs helps prevent future resentment from accumulating. In some cases, forgiveness, whether of others or oneself, can be a liberating path forward. Forgiveness is not about condoning injustice, but about releasing ourselves from the emotional prison of bitterness. Finally, therapy or support groups can offer guidance, validation, and skill building for those dealing with deeper or chronic resentment, especially when it relates to trauma, powerlessness, or long-standing interpersonal wounds. In summary, managing resentment is about acknowledging it, understanding its origins, and taking compassionate steps to transform it into growth, strength, and healthy boundaries.
Transforming resentment into constructive action. Resentment, when left unchecked, can become corrosive, wearing away at our well-being and relationships. But when we listen to it and engage with it thoughtfully, resentment can actually become a surprising source of power and insight. Let's begin by reframing resentment. Instead of seeing it as just a negative emotion, we can recognize it as a signal that something deeply important to us, like fairness, dignity, or belonging, has been violated. That makes resentment a kind of emotional compass. It points us toward what matters. The next step is transformation. Constructive action starts with turning inward. Ask yourself, what boundary has been crossed? What core value has been neglected? Is my resentment rooted in unmet needs or in old stories I've been carrying too long? Once we've reflected, we can begin to shift that emotional energy outward in purposeful ways. Sometimes this means having a hard conversation. Other times, it's about advocating for ourselves, renegotiating roles, or even choosing to walk away from toxic environments. Constructive action might also be creative. Many powerful movements for justice, reform, and healing have been fueled by collective resentment, channeled into writing, organizing, creating art, or helping others. Here's the key. We don't ignore resentment. We use it. We channel it into something that restores dignity, clarity, or change, whether that's in our personal lives, our communities, or society at large. So when resentment shows up, instead of pushing it away, pause and ask, what is this feeling trying to tell me? That question is the bridge from pain to purpose. That's how resentment becomes not a weight, but a tool for growth and transformation. Thank you for being part of today's journey. Your time, attention, and openness reflect a shared commitment to understanding trauma and championing resilience, not just as clinical or academic concepts, but as lived realities that impact our families, communities, and futures. At the Center for Trauma and Resilience Research, we believe real change happens when knowledge meets compassion and when diverse voices come together to drive healing forward. Whether you're here to learn, advocate, collaborate, or reflect, your presence matters, and your efforts make a difference. As we close, we invite you to stay connected, continue the conversation, and carry forward what you've learned into the spaces where you live and lead. Healing is not linear, and resilience is not one size fits all. But together, we can build systems, relationships, and responses that support recovery, dignity, and hope. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to walking this path with you. These are the key sources that inform this presentation. They represent research from psychology, theology, and cultural studies.